Whenever you're ready, Andy.
All right. Well, Sean turned it over to me here and it's 3:16, so we'll go ahead and get started. My name's Andy Held. I use he, him pronouns. I am the director of the Disability Resource Center for those of you who don't know who I am. So what I hope to accomplish here today, first I have to share my screen. That would probably be helpful. Hopefully you all can see a PowerPoint. Did that work okay? I see some nodding of heads. That's always a good sign. And just a couple of quick, I guess, housekeeping notes here. We are recording the session. There was some requests to record it for those that couldn't attend or wanted to view some of the other sessions, which is perfectly okay with me. I think at the end, we're going to probably have some discussion. If folks are preferring to ask their questions maybe outside of the recording, I will take a few minutes after the session to hang out in the Zoom room and try to field those. But I feel like oftentimes with this stuff, the discussion is actually very, very relevant and useful to a lot of people, because I hope we can talk about, some of the things that you all are doing when faced with some of these situations. So we'll record that at the end. We'll kind of record everything. So a couple of things, what I'm hoping to accomplish here today is, I want to give everybody a peek behind the curtain, so to speak, about how we determine accommodations, how we work with students who are coming to us saying that they're likely to be absent for short periods of time, extended periods of time. So when you get a message from us, or you get a form from us, or you get a faculty notification letter from us, hopefully after today, you kind of get a better sense of what led up to that. The kinds of information that we're asking, the kinds of records that we're collecting, and how we arrived at that point that we're now interacting with you to have a discussion about what the student might need and how that intersects with your class. Going to talk through a couple of scenarios which are sort of generalized, but I think speak to some average things that occur throughout a semester with students that we're working with. I will touch upon some of the guidance and insight we get from the Office for Civil Rights within the U.S. Department of Education. That's probably our main compliance resource, and they have a host of stuff that's out there for us to look at and use, including complaints and resolutions, some things that maybe other schools have misstepped. We use that to help us understand what we need to do. A couple of, I guess, caveats here. Keep in mind that what we're talking about, or what I'm going to help you try to understand about our process, is very general. So we typically hesitate to establish a lot of hard and fast criteria or benchmarks or standards, because it's very important that we give everything individual consideration. So individual dynamics and individual situations are oftentimes very different. And one of our main compliance responsibilities is that we look at each situation as it comes up, sometimes every semester. So some things are oftentimes appearing to be quite different. And finally, one important thing that I hope you all will recognize or take away today, and something that we talk about quite frequently, is when we do this and we work with you all to arrive at what is most equitable and fair for a student and their access needs, oftentimes we are in the gray. And determinations sometimes involve a little more art than science. So we try to recognize that sometimes these things are complicated and murky and difficult, and we're all doing the best that we can. So just the basics. I think whenever we're faced with a student request for any kind of accommodation, whether it's something along the lines of extra time on a test, to access to an alternate format textbook, to needing deadline flexibility or needing to consider an attendance policy, we're looking at two primary questions. What is necessary? So that means what is going on with that person, what disability related barrier is their condition or their experience presenting in the confines of the course or the program or the experience that we're looking at. So what is happening? What is necessary for us to consider? So really the what is necessary analysis, we are looking at what's happening with the student. What is going on with their condition? And I'll kind of jump forward a little bit here, or when we get forward a little bit, dive into some specific questions that we talk through with students about absence and illness issues. One thing that's important, I think, for folks to remember or to recognize here is that our primary mission in the post-secondary world is to ensure access. And that is a significant change in framework from the K-12 world, where the focus is more on success and completion. We certainly want students to be successful as a result of using the accommodations that they qualify for. But our determination process is very much focused on what is happening with the condition and what are the specific things we have to do to mitigate that or resolve it. So in some ways that becomes a fairly defined or narrow analysis. The second question that we jump into is what is reasonable? And I think that's where we start turn our attention to courses and raising questions with faculty about the experiences and all of the activities and all of the things that are occurring in your classes. And if we're going to say that something is a requested accommodation is not reasonable, we really have to be able to point to a couple of reasons for why we don't think it's reasonable. The biggest one that I think we run into when we say no to things is we believe it will be a fundamental alteration of the course. And when I say fundamental alteration, what we're talking about quite frequently is that the accommodation requested will make it difficult, or you will not be able to assess what the student has learned, or you will not be able to understand whether they've achieved the learning objectives. Significant changes to curriculum or significant changes to activities, or things like students requesting that they maybe get a bunch of papers instead of exams. We would look at that and say, that might be a fundamental alteration if the instructor can't really assess your learning. The other kinds of reasons that we say no to things are administrative burden. That particular reason has come up more frequently recently when we wrangle with requests for remote access or online learning midstream in the course of a semester already starting. We might go to a student and say, we can't make this happen in the time frame that it would be necessary to make it work. And then another reason to say no to accommodation requests is financial burden. That is a very high bar to jump over. When our friends at the Department of Education look at finances, they don't look at the finances of an individual department or a college. They would look at the finances of the entire institution. So financial burden is not something that people can point to very easily as a reason for an accommodation being unmanageable or unfeasible. The other thing I'll talk about here, or I'll emphasize, these two elements, what is necessary and what is reasonable, we don't always engage in that process in a linear fashion. Sometimes we are progressing on parallel tracks trying to answer those questions. So we may reach out to faculty and begin probing what is reasonable here. We may do that sometimes a step ahead of securing documentation from a care provider, or being 100% convinced that what the student is telling us can be verified, or that we are certain that this is absolutely necessary. And to be frank, that dance that we do there is something that we struggle with, because we don't want to come to you all with things that are going to potentially require some extra thinking or additional effort, without feeling certain that it's absolutely necessary. But sometimes we feel like it's also better to get out ahead of things and begin thinking about it, so we're not caught behind. So those two questions definitely relate to determination processes when we're working with students who are telling us they can't come to class for certain reasons, or they're going to be unable to participate in significant parts of a 15-week semester, or that their conditions might present episodes or periods where they're not feeling well or unable to participate. So really what we're doing in sort of a step one when students are talking with us about this is we're engaging in a pretty robust interview with them, and getting trying to get a self-report from them directly about what's happening, what symptoms are emerging, and what's the impact on major life activity. Major life activity is the thing that we point to when we want to say that this is a person with a disability that requires us to consider accommodations. They are part of the protected class, so to speak. So we're oftentimes discussing with them like what's happening, what are the symptoms, what areas are they impacting. I think when we're looking at attendance issues, we're generally looking at a couple of themes that emerge: thinking, communicating, performing manual tasks, walking, standing, lifting, bending, operation of a major bodily function. Something is going on with students that they can't get to class, or their attendance in class is going to be complicated by a wide variety of symptoms. We're also asking them, what do you do when this occurs? What do you do to manage that, or what do you do in response to that? Do you need to step out of class to take a break? Is that all you need to do? Do you need to use the restroom, or do you need to isolate and rest? Do you do some kind of immediate response, whether that's take medication of some kind, or maybe employ a specific behavioral health intervention? Or do you have to go seek immediate emergency care? Are you going to walk out of class and head to the emergency room? Like, what happens when symptoms flare or the condition emerges in a day? When this happens, like what does that day look like? We're talking to them too, like what's the recovery period sometimes? When this happens, what are, we're asking them, what do you do after that? Or how much time do you need to recover from that? And then we're also asking, trying to get a sense of how frequently does this occur? Is this a daily chronic event? Is this something that occurs once a week, a few times a month? We're also looking at history. What has happened in the past can be very informative when we're having these discussions with students. What happened last semester? If next week, we're going to be talking to students with all kinds of chronic health situations that are going to be looking at adjustments in your classes, and we're going to ask them, how did things go in the fall? How much of this did you really end up needing in the fall? Or sometimes we're also looking at broader trends too. Is the condition getting better? Is it getting worse? Staying the same? So these kinds of pointed questions are really helping us understand in a daily activity sense what is happening with the student. How is this going to come up in an average day or an average week? And we begin to get a sense of what's that narrative, or how are they impacted? What's the impact on major life activity? A note about documentation. So we generally seek documentation that confirms or verifies things. We have forms that we use that are available on our websites that students can take to their care providers and get those completed. I think it's important to note, though, when we're talking about students with extensive absence concerns or chronic health conditions or chronic psychological impacts that, oftentimes they're not running to seek care every time something happens. So we can't expect them to provide a note or some kind of record of every incident that occurs. I think, our team is really relying on that student narrative to tell us details about what's happening. And then we're looking at documentation to confirm diagnoses or confirm treatment history, trying to weave those things together to see if there's, does that make sense with what we know? I'll kind of throw out some examples here of conditions that, that we deal with. Crohn's or irritable bowel syndrome or panic disorders, post-traumatic stress disorder, migraines or other kind of seizures or neurological issues. If we're getting a clear, detailed description from the student of what has happened to them or what they expect to happen to them, we're pairing that with diagnosis information or diagnostic information from a care provider, and then we're going to move forward with that. That's essentially what we're basing, is this a necessary thing for us to consider for you? Where things get a little bit more gray or murky sometimes is students are kind of saying, well, I miss class sometimes, or I don't think I can attend all the time. We're really trying to probe or dig and understand what is it you think you're going to need, or what has happened. We're not going to engage in this modified attendance process or try to really work with faculty to make significant adjustments, unless we have a pretty strong sense that there's something specifically we have to respond to. I think we have other ways to manage more vague conditions. Maybe it's just tracking, or if students aren't sure what's going to happen, we probably set up some kind of communication structure with them where we can check in. So once we have an idea of what is going on, we're really then looking at, your individual courses and your syllabus and trying to identify how the student's condition is going to intersect with that. What is the attendance policy? Is there a point-bearing attendance policy? How are those points doled out or taken away? Is it a per class meeting? Do you have language in there about excused absences versus unexcused absences? Are you going to consider some absences to be more to provide more flexibility based on versus others? Do you have thresholds or limits in place? An example of that is a student, everybody gets 4 absences, and then after that, you're going to dock a half a letter grade for every 2 absences after that. So some faculty have, as have structures in place where they're going to kind of progress a student through some thresholds to kind of a point of no return when it comes to absences. We're also looking at, the activities in a class. What kinds of things are going to accrue points or earn grades that are occurring live in the course? We're trying to identify things like labs or field work or other sorts of activities that are heavily reliant upon peer interaction, whether it's critiques or partner work, and really beginning to understand what's happening in that class and how is one graded or assessed. And then we're also looking at the syllabus and trying to see what is it you're saying about makeups and deadline policies in general. Are you providing kind of a freewheeling system where you're gonna take things up to the end? Do you have more kind of incremental deadlines put in place, maybe around some summative exercises or activities? And what are you all saying about that in your syllabi? Sometimes we meet with students and we look at a syllabus and we compare it to what they're telling us about their condition, and we'll say, I think your instructor's standard policy should be sufficient. I don't think we need to seek any extra accommodation. So that happens quite frequently too. Finally, the other thing we do look at is what are you saying about religious observation or military obligations? Because those are also things that students are protected and require accommodation for, and we want to make sure that how we're treating the different protected classes of people is relatively equitable, or we can defend things. We don't want to create systems where a person with a disability has to really do something radically different, or to earn accommodation for other students that maybe that's just going to be there automatically. So so I mentioned the Office for Civil Rights. Some of you may be aware of this, but for some folks, this may be a new thing. So all of our determinations and how we're arriving at decisions really have to stand up to outside scrutiny if we're challenged. So any student, because we are a institution that receives federal financial aid, could file a complaint with the Department of Ed Office for Civil Rights on any kind of access or disability issue and say that we have not met our obligations. So, they would then receive that complaint. They might open up some kind of investigation. To be frank, this is the kind of stuff we want to avoid. These sorts of things are, they happen. And sometimes they happen and there's nothing we can do about it, or it doesn't necessarily mean we've done anything wrong. But I think the more we're aware of, what are our obligations? How do the federal regulators and the people at OCR, how do they look at these things? The more we can make sure that we're doing what we need to do. So a lot of the OCR guidance that stems from complaint resolutions at other institutions, they are really looking at the nature of the interaction in the class to determine how fundamental is attendance, how fundamental is being there daily, what is happening, what is the student missing out on if they're not there. So they've laid out some questions here. This has been adapted from a Texas A&M resource that's distilled this down a little bit that really works well, I think. So is there classroom interaction between the instructor and students and among students? So is there a high degree of discussion, interaction, group activities? Are there student contributions that are a significant component of the learning process? So are students reviewing things and then doing presentations to their peers on what they've found out or what they've learned? Are there other kinds of group activities that are highly participatory in nature? Does the fundamental nature of the course rely on student participation as an essential method of learning? So I think when we see that question, we're talking about things like lab exercises, performances. I'm thinking about art studios or some of the field activities that are popular in some of our science and natural resources programs. To what degree does a student's failure to attend constitute a significant loss to the educational experience of other students in the class? There is a kind of a sense sometimes that if someone isn't there, that also impacts a peer. The richness of the academic experience, I think, is based on a community of learners. If someone is not there, like how does that factor in? Just like we look at course descriptions and syllabi, if a federal official, if the OCR lawyers would start looking at something, they're going to look at all the same things. They're also going to look at how does a grade get calculated? How do all these activities comprise a final grade? And then classroom practices and policies. Again, they're going to look at what do you have on the books? What are your policies? And how are you viewing accommodation requests? I like to describe this as we need to show our work. If we're going to say that we didn't feel like we could do something because it's a fundamental alteration, we really have to document like why we arrived at that decision. Institutions earn kind of grace and deference either from OCR or from the federal courts when there's lawsuits. They earn that deference when they've documented that there's a process and they can answer questions about it. What doesn't work is if they, if it's clear that there really wasn't an analysis of what was happening. Did you consider other activities and why did you rule them out? You know, just because we said so essentially is not sufficient. So we really have to be able to show our work in order to, I think, kind of not only protect ourselves, but really demonstrate to students why what we do here is important, and the value of an in-class experience. I don't like to harp on the OCR stuff and the federal compliance stuff because that can seem overwhelming and a little bit threatening, but it is part of our work, and it is an obligation that we have to the students that we serve. All right, so a couple of examples here that I think hopefully highlight how we would put these principles into practice. So example one, so we've met with a student and they've told us about they have migraines and they're worried about not being able to come to class at certain times. So student has 2 to 3 migraine incidents per month. They need to isolate in a dark, quiet room for up to 24 hours after the symptoms emerge. So this course that they're in that we're looking at, there's a lecture that meets Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and then there's a weekly lab on Monday. So the lecture attendance policy allows for 3 absences, and every 3 absences thereafter results in a final grade deduction. And then for the lab, students can drop 2 lab reports or drop 2 labs of the 15 of the weekly labs. So we've looked at this and kind of talked to the instructor and determined there's rarely activities in lecture, but the labs and exams are heavily based on the lecture content. So that faculty member has felt it to be a good practice to really emphasize attendance, and they've devised an attendance policy along those lines. That is an entirely appropriate, legitimate, worthwhile thing to do. Then what we have to recognize is that some people are going to bring an experience to us that's not going to work very well for probably, or we have to be open to the idea that they might have to intersect with this or interact with it a little bit differently. So what we would do then is really share with an instructor. We have something called a modified attendance form, and some of you may have seen these, where we will break down kind of individual components of the class and maybe propose some adjustments. So what we would arrive at here, I think I kind of stake out, what's good and what's better, like kind of options. So a good option would be just to tack on another 3 absences before any grade deduction occurs, and then allow the students to drop an extra lab for a total of 3 compared to 2 for everybody else. This is kind of a narrowly tailored adjustment based on what we know about the students' potential frequency of being gone compared to how frequently the course meets. So a Monday, Wednesday, Friday meeting, we're sort of getting our predictive hats on here and trying to anticipate, like, well, what would happen? If they get sick on Tuesday, they're probably only going to miss Wednesday. If this class met every day, we would probably be talking about a different number. So we are looking at the frequency of course meetings and attendance policies, and that's probably where more of the kind of the art comes in more than the science. This can be a little bit fuzzy. I think we're trying to do the best we can to be predictive, but also, understanding that conditions are variable too, and we have to be sensitive to that. I think the better option here, or the probably ideal scenario, is in talking with the instructor, do we need to apply the attendance policy to this person altogether? We know that attendance is important and that the student is likely, a student is likely to do better if they're there all the time. But because we're talking about a student who might have these attendance impacts, what if we just simply grade them based on the activities and waive the attendance portion of it? And then the other thing we might come up with we talked about was, could they attend a different lab section? that week? If they missed their Monday lab, is it possible for them to drop in on a different lab section that week and complete that activity? Because again, they're likely not going to be out the whole week or for days on end. So in this particular situation, based on what we know about their symptomology, they should be able to go to a different lab that week, assuming you all have room for them. So that's part of the discussion here too. So I think what makes this better is that we recognize the way that this student's experience is going to intersect with this course attendance policy is not ideal. I think the attendance policy is well designed and well thought out and well intentioned, but all things being equal, we don't have that luxury of all things being equal here. This person is going to have a different, has a different intersection with that policy. So I think we would try to move towards the better option, but really sometimes we try to give faculty some leeway here, or give them, provide options or opportunities to think through this in different ways. And I think what we would probably also assume is the student is, if they can't be there, they're sort of taking on some of the risk that they may not perform as well. We're not asking the instructor to provide individual instruction time or to get them up to speed outside of the class time. So the student is assuming some risk here on their own as well. Another example, this one's a little bit more complicated. So student requested online remote access in week 11, saying they were returning home for the remainder of the semester due to mental health. Student missed a third of the class meetings up to that point also. So the instructor consulted with our office and shared concerns about the in-class discussions that are part of this course and the associated coursework that stems from that. None of that lends itself to being readily available for a remote experience. So I think we kind of landed on a response here that was two parts. We weren't necessarily sure that remote access is necessary because the reasons we were getting for the absence were pretty vague. Due to mental health, I mean, that can mean a lot of different things. I would want to consider some documentation. I would want to talk to the student and really understand, well, what's happening? What kind of symptoms are you experiencing? What do you do to respond to that? To try to understand, might there be other accommodations short of remote access that could be just as appropriate? So that's where we're really honing in on what is necessary to consider. And oftentimes we're managing student expectations as part of that discussion. I think what we did here was an example of also looking at things on the two tracks, looking also, well, is this, assuming for a second that it's necessary, that we know this person truly can't be there anymore. Is this going to work in the class? And I think after some discussion with the instructor, we were of the mind that no, it won't. So what I think was important in this case was to make sure that this was not, make sure that the student was connected to our office to have this discussion. This was not in this scenario, this was not a student that we had any relationship to. So we weren't really able to weigh in, well, is this necessary? But what becomes important then is that the student be directed and be referred to us so we can engage in that verification process. I think that's an important critical function of our office to really vet these requests and try to alleviate you all of some of that, that responsibility to understand, we don't want you all collecting documentation. We really want to have this discussion with the students directly and then kind of work with you to turn our attention to, well, what will work based on what they're telling us. So some food for thought items here, and we've got about 10 minutes, and this can be kind of discussion oriented. I may jump around a little bit here to encourage some folks to think through this with me and with us together. One, I'm going to recognize you are probably also feeling frazzled, overwhelmed, or burnt out. In one of the prior sessions before, I think Aaron, you mentioned the stress of how do I deal with all of these requests for flexibility while administer the course in a sustainable way. That's what I look at, like, what's sustainable here, because you are all human beings with only so much time in the day, so only so much time in a week. So I think it's important, and I hope you all hear that when you talk to our staff, that we know we've got to arrive at accommodations that are sustainable. So you're all frazzled, everyone's overwhelmed. You're afraid of complaints, or you're afraid of students being disgruntled, which is also a very relevant, valid complaint. I just talked about all kinds of federal compliance stuff that we have to worry about. And our office is really here to support you and feel, hopefully, you're not out on that limb by yourself. Many of you are worried about the kind of the readiness or preparedness of students to be engaged learners. I think we've heard that through some of the sessions already today. Some of that stems from the pandemic, I believe. We've come through this experience that's been very disruptive, and it's had impacts on the educational experience of our students before they ever get to us. It has impacts on their expectations about how we're going to respond to their concerns or their needs. So other points that anybody would like to share along with these feelings of feeling frazzled, overwhelmed, burned out?
I'll just give a shout out to Andy and the DRC that I was working with them last semester on a student issue, and it was great to work with them. So yeah, they're easy to work with.
Thank you. Lauren.
Hi, Andy. I had kind of a unique situation come up last semester. I had a student who had to have, I think, reconstructive knee surgery, and she got accommodations to have online modality for the time that she was recuperating.
Okay.
And so during class, I would do Zoom, and I would be sharing my screen to her, and also simultaneously using slides with my other students. And as a result of doing that for her, I was getting requests from other students who didn't have specific accommodations, and I'm not sure how to tell them no without violating that other student's privacy.
Couple of thoughts. One, that's tricky. I would probably take some time at the beginning of the course, if possible, to talk about what sorts of situations might merit flexibilities or adjustments in a general sense, before you have a person that could potentially be disclosed. So I mean, I think if you or any other instructors have this sort of capacity built in, that's great. But I would try to be transparent about it. Like, you're going to do this if a situation warrants it. It's not there for convenience. It's not there as a creature comfort. If it happens, it's because that an individual needs that for some reason. It's a difficult discussion to have. I think, maybe as I'm talking through this, like, one thing that we could probably do a better job of communicating to the recipient of that accommodation is, if they're up on a screen or their name is up on the Zoom that other people can see it, there's a level of disclosure there that we can't stop. And I think that's a fair thing for a student to know. Aaron, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, less of a question and more of a comment. I guess I wanted to say how much I appreciated the statement you made about sort of the students assuming some amount of risk. I know as an instructor, I have felt a lot of pressure not only to accommodate students, but, ensure that their level of success would be the same had they not had this injury, had they not had this issue. And that has just added a lot of emotional sort of stress to those situations. And so I just wanted to say how much I appreciated you sort of acknowledging the fact that we can accommodate the student, but that doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to do as well as they could have if they didn't need the accommodation. So just
thank you. I would echo that point that we have, a message that we convey to students sometimes, at least when we're talking to them in our office, that, access doesn't always mean you're going to be able to get an A. That's sometimes an unfortunate byproduct of a situation. But largely, we're trying to make this work, and there's not always going to be a perfect solution. And I think most students, at least the students that we interact with, many of them kind of recognize that. They seem to understand that. I just think we have to be mindful about how we frame that and talk about it. We should talk about learning outcomes. We should talk about objectives and content mastery and things of that nature, not about kind of subjective topics. Oh, well, I can't do that because that's not fair to everybody else. Well, those are the sorts of things we should not say. So, Katie, I think you had your hand up, and I see there's a chat that I'll get to in a second.
Yeah. So I appreciate everything that the DRC does. One of the things that has come up quite frequently for me, particularly last semester, I had a number of students who had accommodations with your office to take tests or assessments. And so sometimes they would be sick and then they would need to reschedule. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that rescheduling policy that you have, or should it be more on the instructor about whether the instructor should have a rescheduling policy and how that might be dealt with?
Yeah, I think what we generally encourage students, if they have an exam scheduled with us at a specific date and time, and for some reason they can't attend that, let's say they're ill, we want them to be communicating to us and to you about that. In a lot of ways, we're going to probably view that sort of request to delay similar to how you would, we want to defer to how you would approach that for anybody else who's going to be taking that test with you maybe that day or that time. What are your reasons for allowing somebody to make up an exam? So we're definitely trying to understand, well, why are they delaying this? Like delaying a test is usually not an accommodation. Like we don't give students free rein to kind of move their exams around as they want. Not all, I mean, there's some students that we work with on that, but I think one thing that has come up, especially the last semester or the last year or so, is students with like COVID exposure. We have probably been a little bit leery about having potential close contacts traffic through our office and our physical spaces, because if we have kind of this downstream effect of close contacts among a proctor or an office staff, quickly we're not able to operate anymore. So on some cases, we've sort of made the call that we're not exactly comfortable with that person coming in to take the test today. Let's see if we can delay that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. I think that having some sort of formal policy about how you deal with COVID, though, I think would be helpful. And then and then clarifying that, like in a delay situation, that it's up to the instructor about when that gets completed or something like that.
Okay.
I wasn't sure if you had a general policy that if it's delayed, it needs to be made up within a certain amount of time or something like that.
I think we try to make it up quickly. We don't want that to delay too much. That oftentimes becomes a question of our test schedule and when can we get them back in. But we can probably come up with, I don't know if a specific policy, but maybe it's some communication around here's kind of how we're going to do this. So
Thank you.
I'm not sure who is next here, so I'll let folks kind of
It's
chime in.
me. Can you see me?
Yes.
This is Tweeting Lee from Department of School of Health Sciences, Health Science and Wellness. And my question is, during COVID, I have been very lenient whenever they say they have COVID exposure or they have COVID. Yeah, I have been very, very flexible to take care of their needs. But I wonder, I think I should be a little bit more strict now. I just don't know where the line is. Should I just let them do whatever they need whenever they have excuse, or should I really have ask for the valid document? And from your office, I have seen some clear document that this person need help, this person
Sure.
need, and I will help. But then for students who randomly come to me, said I'm sick, and they say, "What? I don't have doctor's notes. I did not go to the hospital. I did not go to check. I'm just uncomfortable, so I stay home." So in those cases, I mean, where do I draw the line?
It's a tough line to draw. It probably involves a judgment call from you as the instructor. Our office probably is not in a position to get involved in verifying what I generally call routine illness, flu, colds, things like that. I mean, COVID is probably not becoming more part of our collection of routine illnesses. So I don't know that I can say if I were an instructor, I would probably be basing that decision on how frequently am I getting these kinds of requests from this person, and what kind of guardrails or what kind of boundaries can I put in place to give them some flexibility without creating a course with 165 independent study students, if that makes sense. I think that's a tough call. I really do. I don't envy the place that you're in sometimes with a big class trying to manage everybody's unique circumstances. One thing that I think helps is if you're providing some kind of absence flexibility as a standard practice. A couple of days, everybody gets a couple of days to be sick or to be gone. That helps quite a bit, because then you can say to those students, I've already provided everybody gets 4 absences, and that should cover, that generally should cover routine illnesses. People with more significant or chronic things that are occurring should really be coming through us for a different kind of consideration.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I give them 2 unexcused absences. Maybe I need to make it 4. Yeah.
It really depends how frequently your class meets.
I would meet twice a week.
I think 4. If I'm just kind of shooting ideas out here, 4. That's 2 weeks of absence. That's pretty significant, and I don't know how you feel about that, but somebody could get the cold, get especially two different illnesses that might knock them out for a week per incident. That's not unheard of. So, or a case of something like mono, which we're not always going to get a ton of documentation on, where they're going to feel crummy for a couple of weeks. So, as a rough guide, this is very rough. Like, I would be encouraging instructors to build in some flexibility where if somebody's going to be gone for 2 to 3 weeks, that it doesn't entirely sink them. Are they going to get an A? Maybe not. Kind of depends what they miss. Not all absence is created equal.
Okay, thank you very much.
There's 2 comments in the chat that I want to get to here before, and we're definitely over time, which I sort of expected, but these are all good discussions, and I will kind of hang out here for a little bit. Chris asked, how often do you meet with each student to track progress or success with the plan? So when we articulate these modified attendance agreements, I think one of the things we build in there is if the student is going to invoke the plan, they need to be copying their coordinator in our office. So as these things are unfolding, I can kind of have their file at the ready, and all of a sudden they've hit that, whatever that number of absences is, then I know. Beyond that, I don't know that we're necessarily having them come in and check in regularly. We're asking or encouraging them if they're having an issue or there's a concern or they're totally exceeded the amount of absences that we've laid out, like we're going to raise that with them as we're getting copied on these messages. And Kendra, you had a comment about extra time on online quizzes.
Just a comment.
Yeah.
Just letting you know.
Yeah. This spring we're kind of re-envisioning some of the, we provide a lot of training to students on how to send out notices, how to navigate these processes. And, I think we constantly tell them, you need to read your notices because the notices have the instruction. So what you're seeing there may be a gap in that understanding. What I also tell students when it comes to online exams is it's never a bad idea, or usually not a bad idea, to send a friendly reminder to their instructor a day or two before the quiz to make sure that they've gone into Canvas and extended the time, because I believe for you all that extension process is a little clunky, if I'm going to put it nicely. So.
Thanks. Yes, I was pointing it out to students. Finally, I got tired of pointing it out to them, but they seemed a little bothered that I was complaining that they hadn't asked me. But,
again, I think a good early semester message to the, to the whole class is if I'm receiving accommodation notices on your, from your DRC instructor, we're all expecting that you're reading those and acting accordingly.
That's a good suggestion.
And then Brad, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I was wondering, do students who need accommodations, are they generally aware of it? Because I taught a first year class with about 100 students, and I have my general statement, the syllabus, and I say it's generally time and a half, quiet environment. Are there other things I should be including in that?
We have some standard syllabus language that I can share with you that speaks to kind of other kinds of adjustments like these attendance flexibilities or other accommodations that I think drives home the message, particularly to first and second year students, that accommodations are really pretty broad in scope. There's a lot of things that qualify students for accommodations, so we can definitely share that. And if I get sidetracked and don't email you follow up, please feel free to pester me about that. We also make a lot of effort in the summer to get in front of students at STAR when they're coming to campus and getting oriented to campus, so that they understand that accommodations are for things like anxiety and depression and health issues, in addition to some of the more obvious things that students are managing. So I think we try to get that message out. Like a lot of student support offices, the message doesn't always land the way that we hope, but we try.
All right, thank you.
Well, I don't see any other comments here. The last thing I wanted to mention, I kind of tailed off from the PowerPoint a little bit because we were having a good discussion. What I really encourage folks to focus on when I have discussions, when we all have discussions with faculty, is, really use your limited time and energy to think about how can you best assess what the student knows or what they don't know. Sometimes I work with instructors and we want to get them thinking about, what does their disciplinary expertise lead them to believe is going to be a good way to assess somebody, or how can the course be adjusted or the grading scale be reimagined. The role of verifying what the person is telling us, that's really the responsibility of our office. So let us do that. Let us help you with that. You don't have to feel like you need to interrogate your students on whether they're telling you the truth or not. And we can help you with that if it's a health or disability related issue. Dean of Students Office is another great resource if students are having some kind of extenuating circumstances in their lives, whether it's a illness or a loss in their family or financial insecurity. Those folks can be a resource to those students and then kind of help you understand what you can do or what you need to do to be supportive of that and meet any other obligations related to Title IX or things that fall outside of the ADA or Section 504 stuff. So, and then finally, I mentioned this before, but I think it's worth re-emphasizing here too, really the way that we talk about this with students, and you probably all sense this already, talking about it in the guise of being able to assess one's learning, meeting the learning outcomes, satisfying the learning objectives. That is going to get students to understand and step back from any feelings that they might have about, well, this instructor just doesn't like me, or they're not being flexible with me. We really have to focus and help them use that language to manage their expectations. Because students expect things sometimes that we're not going to deliver. And we have to be able to deliver, we have to be able to couch that message in a way that still, is not just a no, but here's why we can't do that. Sean's kicking us out. I appreciate all of your time this afternoon and all of the things that you do to support not only students with disabilities, but students in general. Thank you.